Hello and welcome to our look ahead to what the papers will be bringing us tomorrow. With me are Twyman, who is Director of Delta Poll, and Henry Zeffman, who is Political Correspondent for The Times. Well, some of tomorrow's front pages are already in. The Financial Times leads on President Trump's decision to withdraw from the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, with Moscow warning that the move is dangerous for global security. The Independent's front page is an exclusive which claims more than 40,000 flats across the UK have a systematic structural flaw which puts them at risk of collapse. It comes from research done in the wake of the Grenfell Tower disaster. The Metro reports on the attacks made by Conservative MPs on Theresa May after she conceded the UK's transition period out of the EU could be extended by a matter of months. The Times says things could get even worse for the Prime Minister, with a warning that she faces a rebellion by more than 40 of her MPs if she does not bow to new demands from Brexiteers in the next 48 hours. Whilst the Guardian's front page sees things a little more positively, it reports that the Prime Minister will tell the Commons tomorrow that 95% of the Brexit withdrawal agreement is done. So, a wide variety on the front pages, and let's start with The Guardian. Despite all the woes, all the huge difficulties, the personal attacks and so on, Theresa May is going to tell MPs that the deal's 95% done. Good news, Henry.
Certainly most of her MPs wouldn't recognise, certainly if not the percentage itself, the kind of sunny optimism. It's important to stress that this 95% is just 95% of the withdrawal agreement. So that's before you even get to the perhaps even thornier question of what kind of relationship is the UK going to have with the EU once it has left. And then the other thing that's quite important to stress is the 5% includes the issue of the Northern Irish border. Now, I don't know how they've got to 5%, that
I'm not sure they reduce it to such a small percentage.
But it's certainly, in the top percentile of fraughtness as far as Brexit issues go, and it's very hard to see that Theresa May or her government are any closer to a solution to it.
Yeah, it's interesting to see this positive take on it here.
Yeah, it seems to me that Theresa May and the government are trying to appeal to the kind of people who perhaps aren't paying attention to the minutiae of this issue. Only around about 1 in 5 people thinks that the negotiations are going anything other than badly. And so generally speaking, the broad idea is that it's not going well, that it's getting worse, that it's getting more difficult. And so they're hoping to influence that view somewhat. But it's a difficult job. And as Henry said, that last 5%, I mean, you need the full 100% in order for it to work, and that last 5% is really tough.
I mean, interesting. We had Dominic Raab, the Brexit Secretary, today, suggesting that the transition period could be delayed if that was a solution instead of this thorny problem of the backstop, which has been holding things up.
But I think even those comments from Dominic Raab hint at the broader difficulty Theresa May has, which is getting this deal through her cabinet. I mean, that is more hard line than the kind of position which we seem to think Downing Street are pushing. Now, Downing Street do want to extend the transition as a way of making it less likely that the backstop, which is what the EU wants to impose as a set of arrangements agreed now if the deal all collapses. An extended transition, Downing Street say, would make that less likely to ever apply. But the idea that the EU is ever going to not insist on there being a backstop is for the birds. And Theresa May knows that. And I think Dominic Raab does too, which is what makes it really interesting, him going out and saying that this morning.
I mean, if you were a critic of this situation, you would say, well, it's like a child at school saying, I'd like an extension on my homework, but only on agreement that I get to do fewer questions. I mean, it's just a really odd situation, and quite how the EU responds to it remains to be seen. But it's just part and parcel of this confusion over the issue within Theresa May's own party.
And many in the public getting pretty frustrated with the length of time it's all taking in any case.
Yes, that's absolutely right. There's a whole host of people out there who believe that we should just, quote, get on with it. Whether that is a hard Brexit, a soft Brexit, or however, they don't really mind. They want a real Brexit, and they want it as soon as possible.
There's also people, even in the Conservative Parliamentary Party, there's MPs who might not be so blasé about the consequences of just getting out now, but they are impatient for any Prime Minister, be that Theresa May or someone they might try and replace her with, to grasp the bull by its horns and set out even more clearly what the UK's relationship with the EU is actually going to be like. And Theresa May talking about extending the transition doesn't satisfy that desire in the public, yes, but also in her own party to actually get on and sort this out.
Indeed, and Joe, the Metro picks up on that. Nasty party rounds on May. I mean, over the weekend, we've had all kinds of very aggressive quotes, most of them unsourced, from Conservative MPs talking about their own Prime Minister and party leader.
Well, I mean, just listen to some of the language. Theresa May is entering the killing zone. She keeps going like a lame cockroach in an irradiated environment, and the moment is coming when the knife gets heated, stuck in her front and twisted. She'll be dead soon. And these are from her own team. I mean, it just emphasises the difficult situation that she is in. But at the same time, at no stage is there detail behind this. At no stage is there actually, instead of her, we should have this person in place, because there is no obvious replacement, and there's no clear person with a clear plan for moving things forward.
And in a sense, that's what's enabled her to stay in power so far, is that any of the potential future contenders don't quite want to take over yet. Nobody seems to want to be the one who wields the knife, to use their own language.
That's absolutely right. Although certainly being in and around Westminster over the last few weeks, I have detected, and I think others have too, just a slight shift in the mood from Tory MPs accepting that they think she's rubbish, but she is the best they have, to saying, well, actually, really, could anyone else be actually worse than this? I mean, people have been talking online all through today, or, you know, I know who the anonymous MP using this language is, or I suspect it's this person. I mean, actually, to me, reporting in Westminster, the astonishing thing about these quotes is I can think of dozens of Tory MPs who are angry enough in such visceral terms that they would say these things. And for Theresa May, who only needs 48 MPs to force a vote of confidence in her leadership, that's a really, really dangerous place to be in.
Part of the reason that people voted for Brexit, in some cases, was that they were disappointed and dissatisfied with the political class. This does nothing to improve the reputation of that.
OK, now we're going to move on, because there are some other stories. The Financial Times picking up on this really horrendous tale of the death of Jamaal Khashoggi. Erdogan's threats to reveal the full details of Khashoggi's death, assuming he knows what they are.
Well, it certainly implies that he does, and he intends to reveal it later in the week. Certainly, all the news that's coming out of Turkey is that they have some sort of intelligence, and it's unclear how they gain that intelligence, but some sort of intelligence to indicate they know what happens to him. And Turkey does not like Saudi Arabia one bit, and so any attempt that they can do to disrupt Saudi Arabia will be seen as popular. And the Western leaders are quite rightly questioning Saudi over this. And
the Saudis coming up with various different lines on their explanation for this.
Yeah, it is really interesting just watching how publicly Saudi's story has changed day by day by day. And now they admit that Khashoggi did die in their consulate in Istanbul, although, you know, the story again has changed on how. I mean, what's really fascinating is just trying to work out what Erdogan's game is here. I mean, I don't think anyone believes that he is motivated by, you know, genuine horror at what happened to the journalist. You know, the Saudi are America's main ally in the region, and Erdogan clearly is trying to drive a wedge between Donald Trump and, you know, perhaps more personally his son-in-law Jared Kushner, who seems to have developed a very strong relationship with the Crown Prince bin Salman. But you know, it is going to be really fascinating. The sort of geopolitical ramifications of this are huge.
Yeah, because we had quite a strongly worded statement from the UK, France, Germany and others, but none of them have said yet what, if anything, they're prepared to do in terms of confronting the Saudi authorities.
Well, the Germans have already come out and said that they will not sell any more arms to Saudi Arabia until there's an explanation for what's happened. But that's the weakest possible response. And there's no doubt that Saudi Arabia are hugely strategically important to lots of Western countries, not just the US and not just Britain. But how that relationship moves is very difficult to say. Of course, there's the whole situation with the war in Yemen as well. So this is really, in some ways, potentially the straw that breaks the camel's back. But it may also just be brushed under the carpet for reasons of political expediency later on.
Let's just look at another story on the front page of the FT. Hammond plans to lift offshore gaming tax deals on casino groups. What's all this about, Henry?
Well, one of the most sort of successful campaigns of recent years was a move to dramatically cut the maximum stake that people could gamble on fixed odds betting terminals, so-called FOBTs. And earlier this year, the government announced that maximum stake would come down from £100 to just £2. Now, at the time, the Chancellor, Philip Hammond, said to the Minister, Tracy Crouch, who was responsible for it, that's absolutely fine, but we're going to have to make the shortfall up for the Exchequer elsewhere. And that shortfall, it seems, is going to be made up again by a tax on gambling, this time the profits made by offshore gambling companies registered offshore. I mean, it's been really interesting to watch over recent years the move from how the government sees gambling. I mean, I remember the new Labour government talked about, although it never happened, setting up super casinos to regenerate certain cities, particularly in the north. And now there is a sort of dramatic shift and certainly a lot more knowledge of the sort of psychological problems that gambling addiction can present. And you know, this is clearly going to be a key feature of the budget.
And this is all ahead of the budget in only 8 days' time, where somehow Philip Hammond has got to raise, it's estimated, around £20 billion extra in order to pay for the promises that have already been made around things like the NHS. Now, this will raise some money, but if you're losing 400 million from the fixed odd bettings and you're gaining 1 billion from this, that's only 600 million more. You've got to find a lot more money, and in public opinion terms, raising taxes is a difficult thing to do.
And not that easy to get it from offshore companies either. For now, gentlemen, thank you both very much indeed. That's it for the papers this hour. Joe and Henry will be back at 11:30 for another look at the papers next on BBC News. It's time for Click. Hello and welcome to our look ahead to what the papers will be bringing us tomorrow. With me are Joe Twyman, who is director of Delta Poll, and Henry Zeffman, who is political correspondent for The Times. Many of tomorrow's front pages are now in. The Financial Times leads on President Trump's decision to withdraw from the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty with Moscow, warning that the move is dangerous for global security. The Metro reports on the attacks made by Conservative MPs on Theresa May after she conceded the UK's transition period out of the EU could be extended by a matter of months. The Times says things could get even worse for the Prime Minister, with a warning that she faces a rebellion by more than 40 of her MPs if she does not bow to new demands from Brexiteers in the next 48 hours. The Telegraph says she's facing a revolt from her own cabinet, and that's despite spending an hour and a half on what they describe as an extraordinary conference call to ministers, trying to shore up support for her Brexit plans. Whilst The Guardian's front page sees things a little more positively, it reports that the Prime Minister will tell the Commons tomorrow that 95% of the Brexit withdrawal agreement is done. And The Sun has an exclusive from Mrs May herself. She's written an article in the paper which says she will continue with her Brexit plan, even if it means she risks losing her job as a result. So lots of trouble for the Prime Minister right across a lot of the front pages once again. And Joe, well, The Sun has its own exclusive because Theresa May has written for the paper, but the paper's put its own interpretation on it. May way, with some of the words written out, a full kind of Sinatra-style phrase there.
Yes, I'll resist the temptation to sing it. It hasn't.
You don't have to. You can give us the full rendition.
It hasn't been a good day for Theresa May on Brexit. Possibly her 700th bad day on Brexit in a row. There's talk of a conference call between cabinet members. Never a good sign. Comments in some of the papers today about her, quote, entering the killing zone, and that she'll be dead soon. And this it could be said, is her response. She's written in the Sun and talks about how she wants to give people back control of money and borders, wants to give people security over jobs and the economy. All these kind of broad ideas that the public want to hear, depending on which side of the argument that you're on. But what it doesn't feature is a lot of detail on how this is going to work. She says the finish line is in sight, but getting there is a real struggle.
Perhaps trying to appeal over the heads of our warring party to the great British public.
Yeah, I mean, actually, if you look at the text of the op-ed that she's written for The Sun, quite a lot of it is kind of pitched in a way to contrast her with the members of her cabinet who are pitching for her job. So she says, you know, I don't think about what the implications are for me. I ask myself what it means for you, your family, and for the whole of the United Kingdom. The Brexit talks are not about me or my personal fortunes. I mean, there's certainly more than just a little hint of a dig there at the cabinet ministers or backbenchers who she thinks are plotting for her job. But, as Jo says, it is very short on detail. The Brexit talks are at a very specific impasse, which is over the Irish border question. And you can write as many op-eds as you like in a slightly more personal tone. But if there isn't a solution that she has which is acceptable to Brussels and acceptable to her party, then the talks are going to go on being at an impasse.
And she seems to be trying to sort of brace the public for how difficult it's going to be, talking about difficult days ahead, but again saying, oh, well, the finishing line is in sight.
Only 1 in 5 people believes that the negotiations on Brexit are going anything other than badly. And so the Prime Minister has a real obstacle course ahead of her. And there's no doubt that the finish line may be in sight, but it's still a long way off. And whether that finish line arrives in March or beyond that still needs to be decided. It's a long way to go.
Henry, your paper, The Times, picking up on all of this, saying back down on Brexit or face revolt, May warned, suggesting that the long-threatened revolt could be about to happen.
Yeah, for years, even ahead of the EU referendum, Brexiteers or Eurosceptics on the Tory benches used parliamentary procedure as a way of outwitting the government and dragging them closer to a sort of rupture with the EU. And what the Times reports tomorrow is that they're going to use a sort of obscure piece of legislation about Northern Ireland to try to effectively make the backstop plan that the EU wants Theresa May to sign up to illegal. Now, it is unclear whether they have the votes to succeed on that. Downing Street, the story says, has commissioned urgent legal advice to see whether Theresa May really does need to face them down. But it's just yet another pressure point in what is clearly going to be yet another week of high anxiety for the Prime Minister over Brexit. And you do just have to start wondering, well, how many more of these kinds of days and weeks does she have until Tory MPs stop saying, well, she's the best of a very bad bunch, and start saying, surely no one could be any worse than this?
Because nobody so far has shown any sign of actually trying to trigger this much talked about challenge.
That's right. There's rumours that she may be facing 40 odd letters. She the 1922 committee needs 48. Maybe it's 42. Maybe it's 46. It's unclear exactly how many she is facing. But the question for people like Steve Baker, who, as was said, are very, very clever at using parliamentary procedure, does anyone, Steve Baker or Jacob Rees-Mogg or any other member of the ERG, do they want to be responsible for bringing Theresa May down? Will that necessarily make their aims for Brexit any closer for them? It's very difficult to see an alternative because at the moment there isn't an obvious person, there isn't a plan either, and without either, it's difficult to move forward.
And they all keep insisting that this isn't about removing the Prime Minister. This is about getting her to get rid of the Chequers plan, which they all hate, and move much closer to a much looser relationship with the EU, which is what they want.
And that's possibly true up to a point, but if they genuinely did believe that the Prime Minister wasn't wedded to that kind of arrangement, then they were deluded, and certainly a few of them, either never believed that or are now realising that really it is the Prime Minister and the policy. They come together as a sort of indivisible whole. But you have to ask yourself the question, who is this theoretical Conservative leader who can bridge the massive divides within the Tory party on European policy. And Theresa May has kind of got this far by just fudging the question again and again and again. But we have a hard deadline coming up.
The polling on this is relatively clear. The candidates divide into those who are unpopular and those who are unknown. And that's not a great position to be in if you wish to salvage the best out of this situation.
Could yet help the Prime Minister through yet another crunch week. In the meantime, there is really serious concern over this entire question of the death of Jamaal Khashoggi, who we now know did meet his death inside the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. And President Erdogan of Turkey now threatening to reveal the full details of what he knows.
What we're seeing here is the kind of tensions that have been present in the Middle East and the wider region for some time now playing out. This is all about control for influence over the Muslim world and who wants their particular version of government, of Islam presented more widely. And Erdogan is using this as an opportunity to get at Saudi Arabia. And there's no doubt that Saudi Arabia are in real trouble over this with both Turkey and their Western allies. And we've seen statements already condemning the Saudis. Their explanations have been changing multiple times, which is never a good sign if you wish to prove your innocence. And where things go from here could be very important for the entire region.
Because we've seen some tough statements today from the UK, France, Germany and others.
Yeah, we have, although I think what's much more important here, Joe is absolutely right, is whether Erdogan can drive a wedge between Saudi and America. I mean, one of the most intriguing sort of geopolitical threads of the first couple of years of Trump's presidency has been the closeness of the alliance that he and also his son-in-law Jared Kushner have secured with the Crown Prince in Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman. And clearly Erdogan's game here is to use this case, grim as it is. I don't think anyone believes that he genuinely is heartbroken by what happened. He's trying to use this case as a proxy to sort of drive apart America and Saudi and fill that vacuum a little bit himself.
And you do have to wonder whether they're prepared to sacrifice their strategic and their oil interests in Saudi over this issue.
Absolutely. I mean, there's been a lot of issues with Saudi Arabia over a number of years now, and most recently the blockade in Qatar, the war in Yemen, and now this. But it is a hugely strategically important country for a lot of Western allies, and the degree to which they endanger that remains to be seen. Let's
just look at another story also on the front page of the FT. Howard plans to lift offshore gaming's tax deals. Another attempt by Philip Hammond to get some money out of the gaming industry. Henry?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, this is a look ahead to the budget, which Philip Hammond is going to present a week tomorrow. Now, interestingly, this is about filling the whole cause to the Exchequer by a different policy on gambling. Earlier this year, the government announced it was going to cut the maximum stake on fixed odds betting terminals, FOBTs, from £100 to just £2. And at the time, Philip Hammond said, well, we'll do this, but we need to make up the money elsewhere. And what the Financial Times says he's going to do is raise the rate imposed on remote gaming duty, that is duty from operators based overseas, from 15% to 20 to 25%. The question is, though, whether this is tinkering at the edges or actually does something more substantial to fill the holes in the government's finances.
Because clearly there is a huge amount of concern about young people who get hooked on gambling, but not necessarily proved that easy to try and get money out of offshore companies, has it?
That's right. It's a difficult thing to go after, but the whole situation is difficult. Philip Hammond knows that in just over a week's time, he has to find, it's estimated, around £20 billion extra on top of what's already collected. Now, he could look at raising something like income tax, but he knows that's not going to be popular with the public. And so these more sort of, if you want to describe it as niche taxations, focusing on specific areas, could provide the answer. But it's estimated this will only raise £1 billion, and they'll lose the £400 million that they were getting from the